Welcome to What's Up with Catalight, a podcast designed to raise the many important voices that are helping to shape the future for people with autism and IDDs by challenging the status quo. Your host, Dr. Lindsey Sneed, dives into the thought-provoking topics happening in the industry and at Catalight, from advocacy to research to treatment options and more. Tune in to discover how Catalight's innovative treatment options are pressuring industry-wide change and shining a spotlight on care that's shaping the landscape for individuals with developmental disabilities. This is What's Up with Catalight.
Welcome to What's Up with Catalight, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the voices shaping the future for people with autism and IDD. Join me, Dr. Lindsey Sneed, as I explore thought-provoking topics and challenge the status quo in the field. In this episode, we dive deep into the complexities of ABA hours and dosage with expert guest Dr. Cynthia Anderson. Get ready to uncover insights that are shaping the landscape of care for individuals with developmental disabilities. This is What's Up with Catalight. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining our second podcast guest, but our third podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Cynthia Anderson, where our focus of our topic is on hours, ABA, dosage, oh my, where are we at in the field, our perspective at Catalight, my perspective, as well as Dr. Cynthia Anderson's perspective on this topic that is a really hot topic right now in the field of applied behavior analysis. So I'm so excited to have Cynthia here. This topic has come up a lot recently. I mean, really for the last few years, but I've become really interested the last probably 10 years in the topic of hours and applied behavior analysis. As when I was practicing ABA on a regular basis across a variety of individuals with autism spectrum disorder or even just intellectual disability, one thing that really started to stick out to me is the progress that occurred across the individuals I was serving seemed to be independent of the number of hours they received. And I was having a hard time channeling like how, what is the right amount of hours to prescribe for this population. And as I've been diving into the research on this, there's a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different research surrounding applied behavior analysis, the number of hours that are clinically indicated. And I think ultimately my thinking in this is it comes down to the individual and what is most necessary for the individual. And the heterogeneity of the autism population has grown so much from 30 years ago, even from 20 years ago when I first started in the field. We have such a diverse population that being able to offer interventions based on applied behavior analysis based on the individual need is what has become at the forefront of what's most important. And Cynthia, this is where a lot of your work is coming in because I've followed you on LinkedIn, you've presented at a few conferences, and you have a really interesting study that'll be coming out looking at this idea of hours and applied behavior analysis. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. Thanks, Lindsey. And like you, I have long been interested in questions about what works for whom and how do we remove barriers to access to care. And I think those two can sometimes be intertwined. And so it feels like several years ago now, I, along with some of my colleagues, started to ask questions kind of along these lines. We were noticing some of the things that you talked about, Lindsey, in the research as well as in our own clinical work, that generally speaking, well, something you didn't quite talk about, but that I think is relevant to this, is that in the published research on not ABA in particular, but what I call comprehensive behavioral interventions, because we're talking about those interventions that are targeting a diverse range of skills and characteristics of autistic children. There were really kind of similar outcomes across studies where The model of intervention was different. So it might be more of what you might call traditional EIBI, low-VOS style intervention, or Jasper, an NDBI type of intervention, or even some of the developmental interventions were showing similar effects at the group level. And also the dose of the intervention was varying very widely, but we were still seeing similar effects. And then you add into that there were some studies showing that parent-mediated interventions might be effective. And we were looking at the research and then also noticing, as other people have also called out, in these studies where there's a group effect at the level of the individual, there's still a lot of variation. And so in a given study where relative to a control group, children in the intervention group improved, and there was a statistically significant difference, in that treatment group, there were some kids who improved a lot, some who improved a little, and often some children who didn't improve at all. And I think that was interesting, and it certainly gave us pause, and it's gave a lot of other people also just a lot to think about, and really led us to start to ask questions about, could we design a study to start to get at better understanding the question of what works for whom? Mm-hmm. And that's what led to the study that I think we'll talk a little bit about today.
Fantastic. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't Tristan Smith one of the original people who was doing this study?
Yeah. Tris is one of my heroes. Oh. So Tris at University of Rochester Medical Center was really the pioneer behind this. Yeah. Getting to work with Tris has been one of the greatest things, gifts of my professional career. He's just a brilliant, wonderful person. Also involved with this study is Zach Warren and Eric Buder. So Eric Buder is at Children's Nationwide, Zach Warren at Vanderbilt, and then Cynthia Johnson at Cleveland Clinic are the co-eyes on this. And then after Tris passed away, Tris unfortunately passed away just a few weeks after we found out that this grant was funded. Wow. This was a study that was funded by the Department of Defense. And then Susan Hyman is a developmental pediatrician at University of Rochester, and another phenomenal person came on board with the study as well. Wow. So but the founding group was Tris, Zach, Eric, and Cindy, and myself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was actually Tristan Smith's 2015 study that really, really made me interested in this topic. In that study, they were evaluating factors that impact outcome for a group of autistic children. And ultimately what they found is, in their study hours didn't have a big impact, but really cognitive and social abilities had a bigger impact. So when I found out about this study that we're going to talk about very soon, I got really excited because some of his work was some of the original work that led me to be even more interested in this topic. And it's so important. And I just you mentioned something that I think is so important too at the beginning, talking about barriers to access. And we have such a growing population of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. The current prevalence rate is 1 in 36 across the nation, but where I'm at in California, the prevalence rate is actually 1 in 22. And we have individuals with autism who actually don't want any type of intervention, or perfectly fine with how they are and what's going on. And oftentimes when those individuals coming in for intervention, it's actually not because of their autistic traits in and of themselves. Usually when I'm thinking about youth and adults with autism who don't have a cognitive disability, usually it's more anxiety and depression symptoms that are bringing them in. And then we have, individuals on the spectrum who have what we call now profound autism, who are significantly impacted by their disability, and who have a disability, who have intellectual disability and co-occurring autism spectrum disorder, and need around-the-clock care, and family is seeking out interventions. And then we have individuals on the spectrum who, do want to work on things, but maybe it's around socialization or communication. And I bring all this up to say that the heterogeneity of the population and the needs of the population are so diverse that if we can start to think more creatively about how to provide interventions that are evidence-based, then maybe we can reduce the access to care burden that we're all experiencing, all seeing. And if we can individualize the care, like if individuals do better with parent mediated intervention, for example, that's an area of topic that like I'm very interested in, and I've seen that really be incredibly beneficial and amazing for families. And then I've seen families who have had a paraprofessional delivered model and have had that be so impactful, 10 hours a week or 15 or 20 hours a week. And it doesn't have to be all based in one way. Like you said, it can be an NDBI, it can be an EIBI. We're seeing similar results. So without further ado, do you want to talk a little bit more about your study?
Sure. And maybe before I jump into that, I think I agree with all that you just said. I'm not sure that every child would benefit from an NDBI or an EIBI. And I would love us to get to the point where we're able to say, for this child, this dose of this intervention is where we should be. For example, I'm not sure that a child who is really has co-occurring intellectual disability and is pretty significantly cognitively impaired would benefit as much early on from a child-led play-based intervention. They might, I don't know.
Yeah.
My suspicion is that they might do better early on with a highly structured intervention, but I don't know. And those are the kind of questions that I think are fascinating. And I hope we can answer from a research perspective, as well as people looking at that kind of thing clinically.
Yes, absolutely.
So as you said, the way that autism presents just varies greatly. And so I don't think it surprises any of us that the outcomes research varies widely. Where I think I was at the start of this study and where I am now has not changed, in that I think there's a lot of variables that we should be considering when we think about type of intervention and dose of intervention. And I tend to put parent preference and parents, I'm using the term parent to encompass anybody who is in a primary caretaking role for a child, be that biological parent, be it grandma, be it uncle, aunt, whoever that person is. What makes sense to them, what they are concerned about, and their availability and capacity, those kind of things I would like to see driving intervention choice.
Yep.
You want me to talk a little bit about this study that hopefully will be coming out very soon? It's under review right now. So hopefully very soon it will be out. So we were interested in questions about dose, but we were also interested in taking a look at kind of combining what we might consider to be best practices. So what we wanted to know is if we could design an intervention that pulled from some of the features that my colleagues and I really like about that group of interventions. It's called NDBIs, Naturalistic Developmental Behavioral. I'm grouping the applied verbal behavior interventions in that kind of group and talking about interventions that are child-led, that emphasize engagement and social communication, also parent involvement, and tend to start at a lower dose. And what we wanted to know is if we could take that, but then also pull from a passion of mine, which is an area called modular interventions. And probably most folks listening to your podcast know what modular interventions are. But the idea of modular interventions began more in the field of clinical psychology and behavioral health, and have to do with taking, instead of delivering a kind of standard, say, 16-week or 5 or 6 month intervention, targeting all the reasons why something might be occurring, you break that into more specific steps and approach specific problems, and the intervention is developed via standalone intervention. So for example, for someone who is struggling with anxiety, instead of walking through a 6-month intervention or 4-month intervention, you would kind of figure out what their needs are, and maybe all they need is, I say all, but maybe the primary focus is going to be just on an acceptance-based approach, using some strategies from ACT to focus on having the thought that I am going to have a heart attack, and realizing that's not the same. Or maybe it's just stress reduction. So you kind of break it into what people need. So we thought that maybe we could think about comprehensive behavioral interventions and think about them from a more modular perspective. And instead of going after everything with every child, could focus the intervention on specific needs of children and what was most important to their parents. So that's kind of the idea that led to this. We developed an intervention that we called lots and lots of different things in our studies. We have a couple studies that are coming out on this. We're calling it MAYAC. It's a modular approach for young autistic children, largely because none of us are very good at coming up with cool acronyms. And so this is what happens when you put a bunch of nerdy behavior analysts in a room and tell them to come up with something cute. You get MAYAC. So MAYAC is what we have. And as I said, MAYAC the idea was to have a low dose intervention that's family centered. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but in addition to being low dose, we also emphasize parent mediated intervention. And so the way MAYAC worked is that at the start of the intervention, all children who received MAYAC started out getting 5 hours a week of intervention. And it was 4 to 4.5 hours of direct RBT-led intervention, and then 30 minutes of parent-mediated intervention.
Every week.
And every week. Yep. And so, and the focus of the first that 4.5 hours all the way through the intervention was a specific module that we called social communication, interaction and engagement. And you can probably tell from the name of it what the focus of it was. Yeah. It was emphasizing communication, social interaction, and engagement. So there was a big focus on pairing, we used to talk to our RBTs about make yourself helpful. Your job is to be a helper. So trying to increase communication, engagement, make children see the RBT as fun, as a partner, as someone who is helpful.
Great.
And so that happened for 4.5 hours a week. And I think that honestly, that 4.5 hours a week looks a lot like what many ABA providers are doing. It looks, how many times have you had a parent say, why am I paying for this? It looks like play.
Yes.
That's what we want, right?
Yeah.
It looks like play. So that was going on for 4.5 hours a week. We had a structured parenting intervention that occurred for between 30 minutes to an hour per week, depending on parent. And it started out focusing on discussing the importance of play and teaching and play and child-led play, way to enhance communication. And then we taught parents to embed teaching opportunities into naturally occurring family routines. So how can you use mealtime or getting ready to leave the house or dressing or diaper change or toileting? How can you use these times as opportunities to facilitate communication and to encourage social interaction?
And that, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, of course.
Within that parent-mediated time, that 30 minutes to an hour, was it primarily psychoeducation where you were talking with the parents about it? Or were the clinicians also like modeling how to implement? Were the parents engaging in the skills? Like, was there a behavior skills training aspect to it as well?
Such a good question. And it was a combination of didactic and that we went on kind of an alternating week. Okay. So one week would be didactic instruction, and we have videos. We actually use Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt has a program called Triad that is focused on young children and autism, and they developed a series. They actually developed a whole parenting series, and we used part of that. And so on one week, the clinician, and this was the BCBA, would meet with the parent and use those videos as talking points, as kind of jumping off points, and watch it with the parent and talk about it. The following week, we provided coaching. And so the BCBA would observe the parent implementing those skills with their child and provide feedback and coaching. This is probably an excellent time to mention that the year that we had IRB approval to run the study, the pandemic started.
Yeah.
And so we pivoted in major ways to doing a lot via telehealth. A lot of the parent-mediated intervention ended up being delivered via telehealth.
Yeah.
We had lots of other challenges that I'll talk about momentarily with that, but we did a lot of coaching through telehealth, and it turns out that you can deliver parent-mediated intervention very well through telehealth.
Very well.
We taught our BCBAs to coach through telehealth, and in some ways, I think it might have been better because there wasn't another person sitting in the house.
That's
So
right.
yeah, the parent mediated intervention was a combination of discussion about specific strategies. And each week the parent set a goal with the BCBA about what they were going to work on and what their goal was. And then the following week, practiced and got coaching and would move through modules at parent skill level. So if a parent felt comfortable with a skill and was demonstrating that they were able to do it pretty well, we didn't set specific fluency criteria and such, but
Okay.
we would move on. If the parent didn't feel like they quite had it, or if they had questions, a BCBA might stay with a certain module longer.
Got it. Okay. That's really helpful. Thank
So
you.
that happened throughout the whole intervention. Now, the piece that I think is really interesting about this intervention, MAYAC, is that every 4 weeks, the BCBA would do what's called tailoring. And that meant that they would review their data, they would talk to the parent, obviously check in with the RBT, and they could adjust the dose and or the focus of the intervention.
Okay.
Based on child progress. So we used a number of different ways to assess progress, the data collected by the RBTs and the BCBAs, parent input and such, as well as something that's called the OASIS. It's the Ohio Autism Severity, Clinical Severity Impact Measure. And it's basically just a brief observation. And so the BCBA would do that and observe skills and rate whether the child was briefly improving or not improving, and then use all of that information to decide if they wanted to tailor the intervention.
Wow.
And so the dose could be increased, and because this was a research study, we could increase the dose up to, but no more than 10 hours a week of intervention, because we wanted to hold that steady. And then there were additional intervention modules that could be added as well. And so we had modules that were both RBT-led and BCBA-led parent-mediated modules. And so modules that might be added, and I say added because that 4.5 hours a week of engagement and communication went throughout.
Yeah.
And even when another module was added, it was still added in the context of child-led. So they might add a module focused more on augmentative communication. So if after the first 4 weeks, the child was not making progress with vocal communication, or there just seemed to be real roadblocks, they might add a module focused on AAC, or if that was really important to the parent. We might add a module on imitation if the BCBA felt like the child was not imitating well, and that was really impeding their learning. But everything was in the service of learning to address communication and social interaction, because we saw that as kind of the core difference of autism for young children that we really wanted to go after.
Yeah.
So we had modules like that. And then there were modules that were exclusively parent mediated that would add on time the BCBA work to the parent about parent concerns like sleep or toileting or meltdowns or restricted eating. And a lot of those modules we pulled directly from Ruby, the Ruby parent training kind of thing. So those were the modules that could be added. And again, we could add up to 10 hours a week. That half hour to 40 minutes of parent-mediated intervention continued. In addition, the BCBAs could add one other parent-mediated intervention.
Okay.
So we didn't want them to be doing communication and engagement and sleep and toileting and disruptive behavior, because
it's a lot.
I mean, parents going to pull their hair out. So just one at a time. And so that's how that was set up. There could be up to 3 kind of clinician modules going at the time. So the RBT could be doing the social engagement and also have goals around the AAC and imitation goals, and that was fine. And that's kind of typical of how I think ABA therapy goes.
Yeah, what I so appreciate about the work done for this study is such an individualized approach that didn't make decisions necessarily based on hours of intervention, but truly based on the individual person and the family's needs, whether or not they were making progress. And it's innovative because it's a different way to approach intervention, but everything is an evidence-based intervention. Everything that was provided is founded in principles that are evidence-based and interventions-based in applied behavior analysis. And what I think is so important about this piece, not just in this research, but kind of writ large, is reminding, I don't know who exactly, the field of applied behavior analysis, whatever you want to say, or people implementing behavioral interventions at large, is what makes interventions-based and applied behavior analysis, evidence-based, is not the individual who's implementing the intervention, but it's the strategies and procedures within applied behavior analysis that are evidence-based, and implementing those in a way that is, that we have fidelity of implementation, motivation to implement those things. And just to highlight, and what I'm hearing in this study is you were truly utilizing those evidence-based interventions to support the family and the individual, again, in such an individualized approach.
We were using evidence-based interventions, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's a research study. So of course we did a lot of training and
Yes.
measured fidelity and
Yes.
all of those kinds of things. That was super important. And I don't know what the right dose is.
Yeah.
I don't know. We picked, when we designed the study, we picked 10 hours a week, and we ran a randomized controlled trial where children were randomly assigned to either receive this intervention, MAYAC, for up to 10 hours a week, but no more. Or we called it just more kind of EIBI, although it was really community-based. So whatever the clinics were using, we ran the study in center and home-based programs, and they could use whatever they were using, which varied from what looked more like LOVA style kind of programming to what looked pretty much just like this, just at a higher dose.
Got
And
it.
so we set it up to be 20 plus hours a week for that, what I'm calling EIBI, and up to 10, but no more hours of MAYAC. And so that was the idea of the study.
Yeah.
Again, pandemic. So we'll talk about what happened, but we ran the study. We ran what's called a non-inferiority study. That means that what we wanted to find, our hypothesis was that MAYAC would be no less effective than EIBI.
Okay.
We weren't powered to answer questions about more effective. We just wanted to see if it would be no less effective.
Okay.
So that's kind of where we were going. Do you have thoughts or questions about the specific intervention pieces that you want me to talk about a little more before I kind of just jump into what we did a little bit?
Just to recap, so I think the big takeaway is, for those that were randomly assigned to the MAYAC group, received 4.5 hours up to 10 hours of direct, was it RBT led intervention, paraprofessional intervention, with that parent mediated intervention. And then
That's correct.
the other group that was randomized, it was in that more EIBI 20 hours per week. So those are how the groups were randomized into those differences.
Yeah, that's right. And the idea was that it would be at least 20 hours a week. So if people wanted to, if they thought the child needed more, they could do more.
Great.
So we just held the dose. We tried to set the doses at those two levels to do a comparison of the two.
Perfect. Thank you.
So this was a study that was funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, and they requested that we only enroll families who were either active or retired military, so children whose families received TRICARE beneficiary.
Okay.
And the plan was to enroll 120 children. That did not happen. We because of when the pandemic happened, we were essentially shut down for almost a year.
Wow.
And then, as I think you all can, I don't know about you, Lindsey, but for me, my life is still defined by pre and post pandemic.
Yes, it is.
And
yes.
So everything changed after that. And we had, as I think all providers did, we had lots of concerns from our providers. We had many times where providers were sick and then were out for periods of time. We had families that would have COVID and then not be able to receive services. And then there was a lot of reluctance around families to bring children into clinics or to have providers in their home. And I understood that very well. I was in the exact same boat as a mom myself. I got it. So recruitment was a real challenge for us. We ended up having 27 children who were randomly assigned to MAYAC and 29 who were randomly assigned to EIBI.
Got it.
So we wanted to have, so again, our goal was 120. And the idea with that sample was not only to run the non-inferiority test, but that we might start to be able to answer some of those questions about what works for whom.
Yeah.
With the sample that we ended up with, we were able to run the non-inferiority test. And so we did find that MAYAC was no less effective than EIBI, but we were not able to answer questions about what works, the more of the what works for whom.
Mm-hmm.
And another super important, so just a couple of kind of points about that. When we looked at the what each child was getting, in the children who got the modular intervention, the MAYAC intervention, they started out at the 4.5 hours a week, and then went up to the average number of intervention hours in week 24, which is the end of our
Mm-hmm.
study, was 6.4 hours. But the range of hours was from 0 to 12,
Wow.
and there were more actually because kids were making up hours. But again, the pandemic makes me really cautious about interpreting and saying things like, I think BCBA's only thought children needed that many hours. We can't say
Yeah.
that because the pandemic affected everything. Children in the EIBI group received an average of 14.5 hours per week, but there was, again, lots of variability, including lots of lower dose interventions. So there was a difference in the hours per
Yep.
week. Still, EIBI wasn't at the 20 hours a week that we wanted.
Yeah.
It was at 14.
Yeah.
So, which leaves, I think, lots of questions that we can talk about in a second. One of the things that I think is interesting about our findings, we looked at parent outcomes and parent expectancies, and we used a measure that's called the Parent Expectancies Questionnaire. And at baseline, before the intervention, more parents in the EIBI group thought that the intervention was going to be effective. And so 67% of families in the MAYAC group thought that MAYAC would be effective versus 79% who got EIBI. But that kind of flipped at midpoint. And by the end of the study, more families whose children got MAYAC viewed it positively, 74% versus just a little over half in EIBI. And I don't know why that is. I have lots of hypotheses about maybe the structured parent-mediated intervention made a big deal, maybe feeling like they had a real say in intervention goals. I don't know, but I thought that was really interesting.
No, that is really interesting. And this was something we had an opportunity to chat a little bit about in previous conversations. Was with the MAYAC, it was like that nice combination of RBT intervention and parent-mediated intervention. And, there's so many benefits to both types of interventions or interventions models, if you will. And with the parent-mediated interventions, one of the reasons I think a lot of my area of research and interest is in the parents and how do we get parents supported and on board and feeling more confident in parenting their own child. Because parenting is really hard. I mean, I have 2 children who are typically developing, and it's hard. I don't think any parent would ever say it's an easy thing to take on. And so when I think about our families that we work with, I'm like, man, I want to help them feel more confident that they have the skills to positively impact their child, that they're an effective parent. And regardless of the type of parent-mediated intervention, what we see is positive outcomes for the parents. And not that I'm saying that we shouldn't be looking at children outcomes, because of course we should. But what I am saying is we consistently see in those parent-mediated outcomes improvement in parental confidence and implementing, like in parenting their own child. And we see that decrease in parental stress, which I think is so important, which makes like availability to implement interventions or take advantage of those like really positive transitions that are happening in their everyday life for parents to have that ability to move forward and implement the strategies that they've been taught in a really, really positive way. So all that to say, I guess maybe that's my hypothesis as to why maybe the parent outcomes kind of switched.
Maybe, that there was not a statistically significant difference in the number of hours of parent-mediated intervention.
Wow.
So I don't know that it was hours. Maybe, I don't know that it was parent-mediated. I don't know that that was the factor. I mean, I think it could be the parent-mediated intervention with the active coaching. Our BCBAs really liked to do the parent-mediated intervention in MAYAC. I think they felt like it was more structured for them, and I don't know if that made the difference. I don't know if it was the tailoring of the intervention that the parents
Mm,
like. I don't know.
yeah.
We don't know. And again, there's so many opportunities for follow-up research here that I think would be interesting. Another area that is fascinating to me is if we had been able to, if we hadn't run this during the pandemic, if we ran this study now, and we did set EIB at 20 plus hours a week and held MAYAC at 10, would we see the same
Mhm.
finding? Maybe EIB would have been more
Yeah.
effective. Maybe we wouldn't have gotten the non-inferiority. Maybe the reason it happened is because they both were essentially low dose. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
I don't think so, but it's
Yeah.
possible. So I think there's so many more questions to answer, but I do feel like this kind of individualized modular approach to intervention has tremendous promise
Yes.
for autistic children and families.
Yeah, and like it's like just more research needs to be done, like what you're speaking to, like finding out
Yeah.
like you were speaking to before, like the type of intervention, the amount of intervention, and moving towards that parental preference or even the individual preference depending on age and abilities and all that. Um yeah, because we're getting more evidence that for some children, like I say the idea of less is more. That's not that's not the what we see for every single child. Um, but for some, it's really effective. For some, they do need more hours. For some, parent mediated is more effective. Some they don't, like we were talking about earlier. They aren't even need intervention or benefiting from intervention. Um, and this reminds me of Sally Rogers' study that was published in 2021. The
Yeah.
randomized clinical trial. It was across 6 sites, and they compared that 4 groups, the EIBI or DTT group, and then the NDBI group, and that naturalistic developmental behavior intervention or early intensive behavior intervention. And then they separated it out further into receiving either 15 hours or 25 hours. So there was they're receiving DTT, there's 2 receiving NDBI, and they either received 15 or 25 approximately. The great thing is at that group level, the children at a group level made significant progress. And they didn't see a difference based on the type of intervention in DBI,
Right.
or that more DTT style, or the
Or
hours that were
dose.
received. But we still need more information about the specific dosage. How do we know what is the most effective for a specific child, for how they're presenting, for what the family wants to work on or doesn't want to work on? And I think that modular approach for some families can be really effective because it's just focusing on a few things at a time that are of the most importance to the family. And then I think, well, then you're addressing an area that's so important to the family. And does that increase the likelihood that they're to do the next thing? There's just more motivation to do whatever that next thing is because they saw the previous implementation of whatever it was be so effective,
Yeah.
which I think is, so important.
That's, you bring up an interesting point. And that to me is about utilization of hours. And we know that in many areas, I think the studies that I'm aware of have either looked at Medicaid families or the Department of Defense conducted a study that came out in 2020
Hmm.
looking at utilization. And we know that hours tend to be vastly underutilized. I think that it's a 2019 study by Yingling and Bell, and they were looking at children who are eligible for a Medicaid waiver, and the average utilization ranged between 24 and 48% of authorized hours,
Wow.
and they didn't find differences by race or ethnicity. And I thought that there certainly are differences that come out with race and ethnicity in other areas. So I thought that was interesting. And then the DoD found they were looking at use of comprehensive behavioral interventions that were covered specifically by TRICARE for young children and school-age children. And they found tremendous variability related to utilization, where BCBAs were recommending on average 20 to 23 hours per week. It varied by location in the country, but just on average. But the actual hours delivered was I think the mean was 9.5 hours per week.
Mm.
So vast underutilization that was ranging from 3 hours a week up to 27 on average. And
Wow.
so there's a lot of family variables that contribute to utilization. Some of the research looking at race and ethnicity has shown that satisfaction with the provider, the parent perceived quality of their relationship with the provider, mediates healthcare utilization in other areas, including ABA. And so it makes me think about all of those kind of things too. With if we can increase family buy-in through a modular approach, we might get higher utilization of hours, which would be good for everybody.
Yeah. I think that's I hadn't even thought about that perspective, but the utilization piece is really important. And it's hard for families to commit to a lot of hours. Not every family, but I think for a lot of families, it's hard to commit to a lot of hours, or it can be overwhelming. I know for me, I would feel overwhelmed, but that's like my own experience. But if you can do 10 hours a week or so, and there's a lot of buy-in from the family, it just feels like a really, really effective way to promote positive care and help families get involved and be more motivated, see positive returns on the effort that they're putting in to whatever the respective intervention is for their family and their child.
We certainly need more research in this area,
Yeah.
because one of the other things that stands out to me is that in research studies looking at dose and intervention outcome, they generally have they don't have a lot of problems with retention and hours utilization and such. I think the study that I just talked to you about that was run during the pandemic is a glaring exception to that, but it's hard to draw conclusions about what works in the community from research studies that have really rigorous enrollment criteria. Some studies on some interventions only enroll children who have average or higher IQ.
Yeah.
Well, then what are we left to say about children who have co-occurring intellectual disability? And so the average provider in the community is trying to serve everybody.
Yes.
And I think there's lots more questions to me about how effective are interventions when they're implemented with the heterogeneous population of autism, when they're implemented by RBTs who are not as rigorously trained as clinicians in some of these studies. So I think we need more community sample research as well as research asking questions about dose and what works for whom to help guide clinicians. I think all clinicians want the best for their children and families that they're serving, and we really need more research to help guide those decisions.
Yeah. Thinking about what's effective for the child, for the family, and then also thinking about what is realistic for these community-based providers, I think is what you're saying. Like how can we support them in being in implementing more effective intervention? Because I think that is a really good point, that what we can do in a rigorous research study, it doesn't always translate to community-based intervention. And preparing our BCBAs and RBTs who are out there implementing this day in and day out, what other supports are needed to help them be successful? Because you're absolutely right. I've never met a clinician working with a family who, doesn't feel passionately about working with them and helping and supporting the family and the individual.
Yeah, same.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Cynthia. Thank you so much. I just have one more question for you that's out of left field. And I'm just curious, what is the thing in your work or in your career that you're most proud of and that you feel comfortable sharing with the audience?
Oh boy, what am I most proud of? Probably the work that I have done identifying and removing, how to identify and remove barriers. I think both in terms of research and then clinical practice. Pretty passionate about that area. That's been a focus of mine. It's transitioned recently into an area that I'm really excited about, which is how we can use technology, and in particular AI, to reduce barriers to access to care by allowing folks, regardless of where they live, to access care and by allowing clinicians to work more efficiently and effectively. And that's a topic for us for another day, Lindsey. But
Yes.
that's my current passion. That's my current special interest.
That's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate all the work you've already done, and I look forward to seeing the work you're going to continue to do. And yes, let's have another conversation about that, because I agree, like there's more, it can create more access and reduce those barriers like you were saying. So Cynthia, again, thank you so much for joining today, and I look forward to our ongoing conversations.
Thank you for having me. So do I.
Thank you for tuning in to What's Up with Catalight. I'm Dr. Lindsey Sneed. We hope this episode sheds light on the critical issues of ABA hours and dosage, and the importance of individualized care. Remember, knowledge is power. Stay informed, stay engaged, and continue to advocate for those with autism and IDD. Until next time, keep shining a light on care that truly makes a difference.
This has been What's Up with Catalight, hosted by Dr. Lindsey Sneed. Now you know what's up with Catalight.